Section 16 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Pirate Stories by Various, edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 16. The Terrible Dronez by Richard Glasspoole. On the 17th of September 1809, the Honourable Company's ship, Marquis of Ely, anchored under the island of Sam Chow in China, about 12 English miles from Macao, where I was ordered to proceed in one of our cutters to procure a pilot, and also to land the purser with the packet. I left the ship at 5 p.m., with 7 men under my command, well armed. It blew a fresh gale from the northeast. We arrived at Macao at 9 p.m., where I delivered the packet to Mr. Roberts, and sent the men with the boat's sails to sleep under the company's factory, and left the boat in charge of one of the compradores' men. During the night the gale increased. At 3:30 in the morning I went to the beach, and found the boat on shore half filled with water, in consequence of the man having left her. I called the people and bailed her out. Found she was considerably damaged and very leaky. At 5:30 a.m., the ebb tide making, we left Macao with vegetables for the ship. One of the compradores' men, who spoke English, went with us for the purpose of piloting the ship to Lintin, as the Mandarins, in consequence of a late disturbance at Macao, would not grant permission for regular pilots. I had every reason to expect the ship in the roads, as she was preparing to get under way when we left her, but on our rounding Cabaretta Point, we saw her 5 or 6 miles to leeward, under way, standing on the starboard tack. It was then blowing fresh at northeast. Bore up and stood towards her, when about a cable's length to windward of her she tacked. We hauled our wind and stood after her. A hard squall then coming on, with a strong tide and heavy swell against us, we drifted fast to leeward, and the weather being hazy, we soon lost sight of the ship. Struck our masts and endeavoured to pull. Finding our efforts useless, set a reefed foresail and mizzen, and stood towards a country ship at anchor under the land to leeward of Cabaretta Point. When within a quarter of a mile of her she weighed and made sail, leaving us in a very critical situation, having no anchor, and drifting bodily on the rocks to leeward. Struck the masts. After 4 or 5 hours hard pulling, succeeded in clearing them. At this time not a ship in sight. The weather clearing up, we saw a ship to leeward, hull down, shipped our masts, and made sail towards her. She proved to be the Honourable Company's ship Glatton. We made signals to her with our handkerchiefs at the masthead. She unfortunately took no notice of them, but tacked and stood from us. Our situation was now truly distressing. Night closing fast, with a threatening appearance, blowing fresh, with hard rain and a heavy sea, our boat very leaky, without a compass, anchor, or provisions, and drifting fast on a lee shore, surrounded with dangerous rocks, and inhabited by the most barbarous pirates. I close reefed my sails, and kept tack and tack till daylight, when we were happy to find we had drifted very little to leeward of our situation in the evening. The night was very dark, with constant hard squalls and heavy rain. Tuesday the 19th, no ships in sight. About 10 o'clock in the morning it fell calm, with very hard rain and a heavy swell. Struck our masts and pulled, not being able to see the land, steered by the swell. When the weather broke up, found we had drifted several miles to leeward. During the calm, a fresh breeze springing up, made sail and endeavoured to reach the weather shore, and anchor with 6 muskets we had lashed together for that purpose. Finding the boat made no way against the swell and tide, bore up for a bay to leeward, and anchored about 1 a.m. close under the land in 5 or 6 fathoms water, blowing fresh with hard rain. Wednesday the 20th, at daylight, supposing the flood tide making, weighed and stood over to the weather land, but found we were drifting fast to leeward. About 10 o'clock perceived 2 Chinese boats steering for us. Bore up and stood towards them, and made signals to induce them to come within hail. On nearing them they bore up, and passed to leeward of the islands. The Chinese we had in the boat advised me to follow them, and he would take us to Macao by the leeward passage. I expressed my fears of being taken by the ladrones. Our ammunition being wet, and the muskets rendered useless, we had nothing to defend ourselves with but cutlasses, and in too distressed a situation to make much resistance with them, having been constantly wet, and eaten nothing but a few green oranges for 3 days. As our present situation was a hopeless one, and the man assured me there was no fear of encountering any ladrones, I complied with his request, and stood in to leeward of the islands, where we found the water much smoother, and apparently a direct passage to Macao. We continued pulling and sailing all day. At 6 o'clock in the evening I discovered 3 large boats at anchor in a bay to leeward. On seeing us they weighed and made sail towards us. The Chinese said they were ladrones, and that if they captured us they would most certainly put us all to death. Finding they gained fast on us, struck the masts, and pulled head to wind for 5 or 6 hours. The tide turning against us, anchored close under the land to avoid being seen. Soon after we saw the boats pass us to leeward. Thursday the 21st, at daylight, the flood making, weighed and pulled along shore in great spirits, expecting to be at Macao in 2 or 3 hours, as by the Chinese account it was not above 6 or 7 miles distant. After pulling a mile or two, perceived several people on shore, standing close to the beach. They were armed with pikes and lances. I ordered the interpreter to hail them, and asked the most direct passage to Macao. They said if we came on shore they would inform us. Not liking their hostile appearance, I did not think proper to comply with the request. Saw a large fleet of boats at anchor close under the opposite shore. Our interpreter said they were fishing boats, and that by going there we should not only get provisions, but a pilot also to take us to Macao. I bore up, and on nearing them perceived there were some large vessels very full of men, and mounted with several guns. I hesitated to approach nearer, but the Chinese assuring me they were Mandarin junks and salt boats, we stood close to one of them, and asked the way to Macao. They gave no answer, but made some signs to us to go on shore. We passed on, and a large rowboat pulled after us. She soon came alongside, when about 20 savage-looking villains, who were stowed at the bottom of the boat, leaped on board us. They were armed with a short sword in each hand, one of which they laid on our necks, and the other pointed to our breasts, keeping their eyes fixed on their officer, waiting his signal to cut or desist. Seeing we were incapable of making any resistance, he sheathed his sword, and the others immediately followed his example. They then dragged us into their boat, and carried us on board one of their junks, with the most savage demonstrations of joy, and as we supposed, to torture and put us to a cruel death. When on board the junk, they searched all our pockets, took the handkerchiefs from our necks, and brought heavy chains to chain us to the guns. At this time a boat came, and took me, with one of my men and the interpreter, on board the chief's vessel. I was then taken before the chief. He was seated on deck, in a large chair, dressed in purple silk, with a black turban on. He appeared to be about 30 years of age, a stout, commanding-looking man. He took me by the coat, and drew me close to him, then questioned the interpreter very strictly, asking who we were, and what was our business in that part of the country. I told him to say we were Englishmen in distress, having been 4 days at sea without provisions. This he would not credit, but said we were bad men, and that he would put us all to death, and then ordered some men to put the interpreter to the torture until he confessed the truth. Upon this occasion a ladron, who had been once to England and spoke a few words of English, came to the chief, and told him we were really Englishmen, and that we had plenty of money, adding that the buttons on my coat were gold. The chief then ordered us some coarse brown rice, of which we made a tolerable meal, having eaten nothing for nearly 4 days, except a few green oranges. During our repast, a number of ladrones crowded round us, examining our clothes and hair, and giving us every possible annoyance. Several of them brought swords, and laid them on our necks, making signs that they would soon take us on shore, and cut us in pieces, which I am sorry to say was the fate of some hundreds during my captivity. I was now summoned before the chief, who had been conversing with the interpreter. He said I might write to my captain, and tell him if he did not send $100,000 for our ransom, in 10 days he would put us all to death. In vain did I assure him it was useless writing, unless he would agree to take a much smaller sum, saying we were all poor men, and the most we could possibly raise would not exceed $2,000. Finding that he was much exasperated at my expostulations, I embraced the offer of writing to inform my commander of our unfortunate situation, though there appeared not the least probability of relieving us. They said the letter should be conveyed to Macao in a fishing boat, which would bring an answer in the morning. A small boat accordingly came alongside and took the letter. About 6 o'clock in the evening they gave us some rice and a little salt fish, which we ate, and they made signs for us to lay down on the deck to sleep. But such numbers of ladrones were constantly coming from different vessels to see us and examine our clothes and hair, they would not allow us a moment's quiet. They were particularly anxious for the buttons of my coat, which were new, and as they supposed gold. I took it off and laid it on the deck to avoid being disturbed by them. It was taken away in the night, and I saw it on the next day stripped of its buttons. About 9 o'clock a boat came and hailed the chief's vessel. He immediately hoisted his mainsail, and the fleet weighed, apparently in great confusion. They worked to windward all night and part of the next day, and anchored about 1 o'clock in a bay under the island of Lantau, where the head admiral of the Dronez was lying at anchor, with about 200 vessels and a Portuguese brig they had captured a few days before, and murdered the captain and part of the crew. Saturday the 23rd, early in the morning, a fishing boat came to the fleet to inquire if they had captured an European boat. Being answered in the affirmative, they came to the vessel I was in. One of them spoke a few words of English, and told me he had a ladron pass, and was sent by Captain K in search of us. I was rather surprised to find he had no letter. He appeared to be well acquainted with the chief, and remained in his cabin, smoking opium and playing cards all the day. In the evening I was summoned with the interpreter before the chief. He questioned us in a much milder tone, saying he now believed we were Englishmen, a people he wished to be friendly with, and that if our captain would lend him $70,000 till he returned from his cruise up the river, he would repay him, and send us all to Macao. I assured him it was useless writing on those terms, and unless our ransom was speedily settled, the English fleet would sail, and render our enlargement altogether ineffectual. He remained determined, and said if it were not sent, he would keep us and make us fight, or put us to death. I accordingly wrote, and gave my letter to the man belonging to the boat before mentioned. He said he could not return with an answer in less than 5 days. The chief now gave me the letter I wrote when first taken. I have never been able to ascertain his reasons for detaining it, but suppose he dared not negotiate for our ransom without orders from the head admiral, who I understood was sorry at our being captured. He said the English ships would join the Mandarins and attack them. He told the chief that captured us to dispose of us as he pleased. Monday the 24th it blew a strong gale, with constant hard rain. We suffered much from the cold and wet, being obliged to remain on deck with no covering but an old mat, which was frequently taken from us in the night by the ladrones who were on watch. During the night the Portuguese who were left in the brig murdered the ladrones that were on board of her, cut the cables, and fortunately escaped through the darkness of the night. I have since been informed they ran her on shore near Macao. Tuesday the 25th at daylight in the morning, the fleet, amounting to about 500 sail of different sizes, weighed to proceed on their intended cruise up the rivers to levy contributions on the towns and villages. It is impossible to describe what were my feelings at this critical time, having received no answers to my letters, and the fleet under way to sail, hundreds of miles up a country never visited by Europeans, there to remain probably for many months, which would render all opportunities of negotiating for our enlargement totally ineffectual, as the only method of communication is by boats that have a pass from the ladrones, and they dare not venture above 20 miles from Macao, being obliged to come and go in the night, to avoid the Mandarins, and if these boats should be detected in having any intercourse with the ladrones, they are immediately put to death, and all their relations, though they had not joined in the crime, share in the punishment, in order that not a single person of their family should be left to imitate their crimes or revenge their death. This severity renders communication both dangerous and expensive. No boat would venture out for less than 100 Spanish dollars. Wednesday the 26th, at daylight, we passed in sight of our ships at anchor under the island of Chun Po. The chief then called me, pointed to the ships, and told the interpreter to tell us to look at them, for we should never see them again. About noon we entered a river to the westward of the Bogue, 3 or 4 miles from the entrance. We passed a large town situated on the side of a beautiful hill, which is tributary to the Dronez. The inhabitants saluted them with songs as they passed. The fleet now divided into 2 squadrons, the red and the black, and sailed up different branches of the river. At midnight the division we were in anchored close to an immense hill, on the top of which a number of fires were burning, which at daylight I perceived proceeded from a Chinese camp. At the back of the hill was a most beautiful town, surrounded by water and embellished with groves of orange trees. The chop house, custom house, and a few cottages were immediately plundered and burned down. Most of the inhabitants, however, escaped to the camp. The Ladrones now prepared to attack the town with a formidable force, collected in rowboats from the different vessels. They sent a messenger to the town, demanding a tribute of $10,000 annually, saying if these terms were not complied with, they would land, destroy the town, and murder all the inhabitants, which they would certainly have done had the town laid in a more advantageous situation for their purpose. But being placed out of the reach of their shot, they allowed them to come to terms. The inhabitants agreed to pay $6,000, which they were to collect by the time of our return down the river. This finesse had the desired effect, for during our absence they mounted a few guns on a hill which commanded the passage, and gave us in lieu of the dollars a warm salute on our return. October the 1st, the fleet weighed in the night, dropped by the tide up the river, and anchored very quietly before a town surrounded by a thick wood. Early in the morning the Ladrones assembled in rowboats and landed, then gave a shout and rushed into the town, sword in hand. The inhabitants fled to the adjacent hills, in numbers apparently superior to the Ladrones. We may easily imagine to ourselves the horror with which these miserable people must be seized, on being obliged to leave their homes and everything dear to them. It was a most melancholy sight to see women in tears, clasping their infants in their arms, and imploring mercy for them from those brutal robbers. The old and the sick, who were unable to fly or to make resistance, were either made prisoners or most inhumanly butchered. The boats continued passing and repassing from the junks to the shore, in quick succession, laden with booty, and the men besmeared with blood. 250 women and several children were made prisoners and sent on board different vessels. They were unable to escape with the men, owing to that abominable practice of cramping their feet. Several of them were not able to move without assistance. In fact, they might all be said to totter rather than walk. 20 of these poor women were sent on board the vessel I was in. They were hauled on board by the hair, and treated in a most savage manner. When the chief came on board, he questioned them respecting the circumstances of their friends, and demanded ransoms accordingly, from $6,000 to $600 each. He ordered them a berth on deck, at the after part of the vessel, where they had nothing to shelter them from the weather, which at this time was very variable, the days excessively hot and the nights cold with heavy rains. The town being plundered of everything valuable, it was set on fire, and reduced to ashes by the morning. The fleet remained here 3 days, negotiating for the ransom of the prisoners, and plundering the fish tanks and gardens. During all this time, the Chinese never ventured from the hills, though there were frequently not more than 100 Ladrones on shore at a time, and I am sure the people on the hills exceeded 10 times that number. October the 5th, the fleet proceeded up another branch of the river, stopping at several small villages to receive tribute, which was generally paid in dollars, sugar and rice, with a few large pigs roasted whole, as presents for their joss, the idol they worship. Every person, on being ransomed, is obliged to present him with a pig or some fowls, which the priest offers him with prayers. It remains before him a few hours, and is then divided amongst the crew. Nothing particular occurred till the 10th, except frequent skirmishes on shore between small parties of Ladrones and Chinese soldiers. They frequently obliged my men to go on shore, and fight with the muskets we had when taken, which did great execution, the Chinese principally using bows and arrows. They have matchlocks, but use them very unskilfully. On the 10th we formed a junction with the Black Squadron, and proceeded many miles up a wide and beautiful river, passing several ruins of villages that had been destroyed by the Black Squadron. On the 17th, the fleet anchored abreast 4 mud batteries, which defended a town, so entirely surrounded with wood that it was impossible to form any idea of its size. The weather was very hazy, with hard squalls of rain. The Ladrones remained perfectly quiet for 2 days. On the 3rd day the forts commenced a brisk fire for several hours. The Ladrones did not return a single shot, but weighed in the night and dropped down the river. The reasons they gave for not attacking the town or returning the fire were that Joss had not promised them success. They are very superstitious and consult their idol on all occasions. If his omens are good, they will undertake the most daring enterprises. The fleet now anchored opposite the ruins of the town where the women had been made prisoners. Here we remained 5 or 6 days, during which time about 100 of the women were ransomed. The remainder were offered for sale amongst the Ladrones for $40 each. The woman is considered the lawful wife of the purchaser, who would be put to death if he discarded her. Several of them leaped overboard and drowned themselves, rather than submit to such infamous degradation. The fleet then weighed and made sail down the river to receive the ransom from the town before mentioned. As we passed the hill, they fired several shots at us, but without effect. The Ladrones were much exasperated and determined to revenge themselves. They dropped out of reach of their shot and anchored. Every junk sent about 100 men each on shore to cut paddy and destroy their orange groves, which was most effectually performed for several miles down the river. During our stay here they received information of 9 boats lying up a creek, laden with paddy. Boats were immediately dispatched after them. Next morning these boats were brought to the fleet. 10 or 12 men were taken in them. As these had made no resistance, the chief said he would allow them to become Ladrones if they agreed to take the usual oaths before Joss. 3 or 4 of them refused to comply, for which they were punished in the following cruel manner. Their hands were tied behind their back, a rope from the masthead rove through their arms, and hoisted 3 or 4 feet from the deck, and 5 or 6 men flogged them with 3 rattans twisted together till they were apparently dead, then hoisted them up to the masthead and left them hanging nearly an hour, then lowered them down and repeated the punishment till they died or complied with the oath. October the 20th, in the night, an express boat came with information that a large Mandarin fleet was proceeding up the river to attack us. The chief immediately weighed with 50 of the largest vessels and sailed down the river to meet them. About 1 in the morning they commenced a heavy fire till daylight, when an express was sent for the remainder of the fleet to join them. About an hour after, a counter order to anchor came, the Mandarin fleet having run. 2 or 3 hours afterwards the chief returned with 3 captured vessels in tow, having sunk 2, and 83 sail made their escape. The admiral of the Mandarines blew his vessel up by throwing a lighted match into the magazine as the Ladrones were boarding her. She ran on shore, and they succeeded in getting 20 of her guns. In this action very few prisoners were taken. The men belonging to the captured vessels drowned themselves, as they were sure of suffering a lingering and cruel death if taken after making resistance. The admiral left the fleet in charge of his brother, the second in command, and proceeded with his own vessel towards Lantow. The fleet remained in this river, cutting paddy and getting the necessary supplies. On the 28th of October I received a letter from Captain K, brought by a fisherman, who had told him he would get us all back for $3,000. He advised me to offer 3,000, and if not accepted, extend it to 4, but not farther, as it was bad policy to offer much at first, at the same time assuring me we should be liberated, let the ransom be what it would. I offered the chief the 3,000, which he disdainfully refused, saying he was not to be played with, and unless they sent $10,000 and 2 large guns with several casks of gunpowder, he would soon put us all to death. I wrote to Captain K and informed him of the chief's determination, requesting, if an opportunity offered, to send us a shift of clothes, for which it may be easily imagined we were much distressed, having been 7 weeks without a shift, although constantly exposed to the weather and of course frequently wet. On the 1st of November the fleet sailed up a narrow river and anchored at night within 2 miles of a town called Little Whampoa. In front of it was a small fort and several Mandarin vessels lying in the harbour. The chief sent the interpreter to me, saying I must order my men to make cartridges and clean their muskets, ready to go on shore in the morning. I assured the interpreter I should give the men no such orders, that they must please themselves. Soon after the chief came on board, threatening to put us all to a cruel death if we refused to obey his orders. For my own part I remained determined, and advised the men not to comply, as I thought by making ourselves useful we should be accounted too valuable. A few hours afterwards he sent to me again, saying that if myself and the quartermaster would assist them at the great guns, that if also the rest of the men went on shore and succeeded in taking the place, he would then take the money offered for our ransom and give them $20 for every Chinaman's head they cut off. To these proposals we cheerfully acceded, in hopes of facilitating our deliverance. Early in the morning the forces intended for landing were assembled in rowboats, amounting in the whole to 3,000 or 4,000 men. The largest vessels weighed and hauled in shore to cover the landing of the forces and attack the fort and Mandarin vessels. About 9 o'clock the action commenced, and continued with great spirit for nearly an hour, when the walls of the fort gave way, and the men retreated in the greatest confusion. The Mandarin vessels still continued firing, having blocked up the entrance of the harbour to prevent the Ladrone boats entering. At this the Ladrones were much exasperated, and about 300 of them swam on shore, with a short sword lashed close under each arm. They then ran along the banks of the river till they came abreast of the vessels, and then swam off again and boarded them. The Chinese, thus attacked, leaped overboard, and endeavoured to reach the opposite shore. The Ladrones followed, and cut the greater number of them to pieces in the water. They next towed the vessels out of the harbour, and attacked the town with increased fury. The inhabitants fought about a quarter of an hour, and then retreated to an adjacent hill, from which they were soon driven with great slaughter. After this the Ladrones returned and plundered the town, every boat leaving it when laden. The Chinese on the hills, perceiving most of the boats were off, rallied and retook the town, after killing near 200 Ladrones. One of my men was unfortunately lost in this dreadful massacre. The Ladrones landed a second time, drove the Chinese out of the town, then reduced it to ashes, and put all their prisoners to death, without regarding either age or sex. I must not omit to mention a most horrid, though ludicrous, circumstance which happened at this place. The Ladrones were paid by their chief $10 for every Chinaman's head they produced. One of my men, turning the corner of a street, was met by a Ladrone running furiously after a Chinese. He had a drawn sword in his hand, and 2 Chinaman's heads which he had cut off, tied by their tails, and slung round his neck. I was witness myself to some of them producing 5 or 6 to obtain payment. On the 4th of November an order arrived from the Admiral for the fleet to proceed immediately to Lantow, where he was lying with only 2 vessels, and 3 Portuguese ships and a brig constantly annoying him. Several sail of Mandarin vessels were daily expected. The fleet weighed and proceeded towards Lantow. On passing the island of Lintin, 3 ships and a brig gave chase to us. The Ladrones prepared to board, but night closing we lost sight of them. I am convinced they altered their course and stood from us. These vessels were in the pay of the Chinese government, and styled themselves the Invincible Squadron, cruising in the river Tigris to annihilate the Ladrones. On the 5th in the morning the Red Squadron anchored in a bay under Lantow. The Black Squadron stood to the eastward. In this bay they hauled several of their vessels on shore to bream their bottoms and repair them. In the afternoon of the 8th of November 4 ships, a brig and a schooner came off the mouth of the bay. At first the pirates were much alarmed, supposing them to be English vessels come to rescue us. Some of them threatened to hang us to the masthead for them to fire at, and with much difficulty we persuaded them that they were Portuguese. The Ladrones had only 7 junks in a fit state for action. These they hauled outside, and moored them head and stern across the bay, and manned all the boats belonging to the repairing vessels ready for boarding. The Portuguese, observing these manoeuvres, hove to, and communicated by boats. Soon afterwards they made sail, each ship firing her broadside as she passed, but without effect, the shot falling far short. The Ladrones did not return a single shot, but waved their colours and threw up rockets to induce them to come further in, which they might easily have done, the outside junks lying in 4 fathoms water, which I sounded myself. though the Portuguese in their letters to Macao lamented there was not sufficient water for them to engage closer, but that they would certainly prevent their escaping before the Mandarin Fleet arrived. On the 20th of November, early in the morning, I perceived an immense fleet of Mandarin vessels standing for the bay. On nearing us they formed a line, and stood close in, each vessel, as she discharged her guns, tacked to join the rear and reload. They kept up a constant fire for about 2 hours, when one of their largest vessels was blown up by a firebrand thrown from a ladron junk, after which they kept at a more respectful distance, but continued firing without intermission till the 21st at night, when it fell calm. The ladrones towed out 7 large vessels, with about 200 rowboats to board them, but a breeze springing up, they made sail and escaped. The ladrones returned into the bay and anchored. The Portuguese and Mandarines followed, and continued a heavy cannonading during that night and the next day. The vessel I was in had her foremast shot away, which they supplied very expeditiously by taking a mainmast from a smaller vessel. On the 23rd in the evening it again fell calm. The ladrones towed out 15 junks in 2 divisions, with the intention of surrounding them, which was nearly effected, having come up with and boarded one, when a breeze suddenly sprung up. The captured vessel mounted 22 guns. Most of her crew leaped overboard. 60 or 70 were taken immediately, cut to pieces and thrown into the river. Early in the morning the ladrones returned into the bay, and anchored in the same situation as before. The Portuguese and Mandarines followed, keeping up a constant fire. The ladrones never returned a single shot, but always kept in readiness to board, and the Portuguese were careful never to allow them an opportunity. On the 28th at night they sent in 8 fire vessels, which if properly constructed must have done great execution, having every advantage they could wish for to effect their purpose. A strong breeze and tide directly into the bay, and the vessels lying so close together that it was impossible to miss them. On their first appearance the ladrones gave a general shout, supposing them to be Mandarin vessels on fire, but were very soon convinced of their mistake. They came very regularly into the centre of the fleet, 2 and 2, burning furiously. One of them came alongside of the vessel I was in, but they succeeded in booming her off. She appeared to be a vessel of about 30 tons. Her hold was filled with straw and wood, and there were a few small boxes of combustibles on her deck, which exploded alongside of us without doing any damage. The ladrones, however, towed them all on shore, extinguished the fire, and broke them up for firewood. The Portuguese claimed the credit of constructing these destructive machines, and actually sent a dispatch to the governor of Macao, saying they had destroyed at least 1/3 of the ladrones' fleet, and hoped soon to effect their purpose by totally annihilating them. On the 29th of November, the ladrones being all ready for sea, they weighed and stood boldly out, bidding defiance to the invincible squadron and imperial fleet, consisting of 93 war junks, 6 Portuguese ships, a brig and a schooner. Immediately the ladrones weighed, they made all sail. The ladrones chased them 2 or 3 hours, keeping up a constant fire. Finding they did not come up with them, they hauled their wind and stood to the eastward. Thus terminated the boasted blockade, which lasted 9 days, during which time the ladrones completed all their repairs. In this action not a single ladron vessel was destroyed, and their loss about 30 or 40 men. An American was also killed, one of 3 that remained out of 8 taken in a schooner. I had 2 very narrow escapes. The first, a 12-pounder shot fell within 3 or 4 feet of me. Another took a piece out of a small brass swivel on which I was standing. The chief's wife frequently sprinkled me with garlic water, which they consider an effectual charm against shot. The fleet continued under sail all night, steering towards the eastward. In the morning they anchored in a large bay surrounded by lofty and barren mountains. On the 2nd of December I received a letter from Lieutenant Mogul, commander of the Honourable Company's cruiser Antelope, saying that he had the ransom on board, and had been 3 days cruising after us, and wished me to settle with the chief on the securest method of delivering it. The chief agreed to send us in a small gunboat, till we came within sight of the Antelope. Then the compradore's boat was to bring the ransom and receive us. I was so agitated at receiving this joyful news, that it was with considerable difficulty I could scrawl about 2 or 3 lines to inform Lieutenant Mogul of the arrangements I had made. We were all so deeply affected by the gratifying tidings that we seldom closed our eyes, but continued watching day and night for the boat. On the 6th she returned with Lieutenant Morgan's answer, saying he would respect any single boat, but would not allow the fleet to approach him. The chief then, according to his first proposal, ordered a gunboat to take us, and with no small degree of pleasure we left the Ladrone fleet about 4 o'clock in the morning. At 1 p.m. saw the Antelope under all sail, standing toward us. The Ladrone boat immediately anchored, and dispatched the Compradore's boat for the ransom, saying that if she approached nearer, they would return to the fleet, and they were just weighing when she shortened sail, and anchored about 2 miles from us. The boat did not reach her till late in the afternoon, owing to the tides being strong against her. She received the ransom, and left the Antelope just before dark. A Mandarin boat that had been lying concealed under the land, and watching their manoeuvres, gave chase to her, and was within a few fathoms of taking her, when she saw a light, which the Ladrones answered, and the Mandarin hauled off. Our situation was now a most critical one. The ransom was in the hands of the Ladrones, and the Compradore dare not return with us for fear of a second attack from the Mandarin boat. The Ladrones would not remain till morning, so we were obliged to return with them to the fleet. In the morning the chief inspected the ransom, which consisted of the following articles: 2 bales of superfine scarlet cloth, 2 chests of opium, 2 casks of gunpowder, and a telescope, the rest in dollars. He objected to the telescope not being new, and said he should detain one of us till another was sent, or $100 in lieu of it. The Compradore, however, agreed with him for the $100. Everything being at length settled, the chief ordered 2 gunboats to convey us near the Antelope. We saw her just before dusk, when the Ladrone boats left us. We had the inexpressible pleasure of arriving on board the Antelope at 7 p.m., where we were most cordially received, and heartily congratulated on our safe and happy deliverance from a miserable captivity, which we had endured for 11 weeks and 3 days. A few remarks on the origin, progress, manners, and customs of the Ladrones. The Ladrones are a disaffected race of Chinese that revolted against the oppressions of the Mandarins. They first commenced their depredations on the western coast, Cochin China, by attacking small trading vessels in rowboats, carrying from 30 to 40 men each. They continued this system of piracy several years. At length their successes and the oppressive state of the Chinese had the effect of rapidly increasing their numbers. Hundreds of fishermen and others flocked to their standard, and as their number increased, they consequently became more desperate. They blockaded all the principal rivers, and captured several large junks, mounting from 10 to 15 guns each. With these junks they formed a very formidable fleet, and no small vessels could trade on the coast with safety. They plundered several small villages, and exercised such wanton barbarity as struck horror into the hearts of the Chinese. To check these enormities, the government equipped a fleet of 40 imperial war junks, mounting from 18 to 20 guns each. On the very first rencontre, 28 of the imperial junks struck to the pirates. The rest saved themselves by a precipitate retreat. These junks, fully equipped for war, were a great acquisition to them. Their numbers augmented so rapidly that at the period of my captivity they were supposed to amount to near 70,000 men, 800 large vessels, and nearly 1,000 small ones, including rowboats. They were divided into 5 squadrons, distinguished by different coloured flags, each squadron commanded by an admiral or chief, but all under the orders of Juo Che, Qing Yi Sao, their premier chief, a most daring and enterprising man, who went so far as to declare his intention of displacing the present Tartar family from the throne of China, and to restore the ancient Chinese dynasty. This extraordinary character would have certainly shaken the foundation of the government, had he not been thwarted by the jealousy of the second in command, who declared his independence, and soon after surrendered to the Mandarins with 500 vessels, on promise of a pardon. Most of the inferior chiefs followed his example. Juo Che, Qing Yi Sao, held out a few months longer, and at length surrendered with 16,000 men, on condition of a general pardon, and himself to be made a Mandarin of distinction. The Ladrones have no settled residence on shore, but live constantly in their vessels. The after part is appropriated to the captain and his wives. He generally has 5 or 6. With respect to conjugal rights, they are religiously strict. No person is allowed to have a woman on board unless married to her according to their laws. Every man is allowed a small berth, about 4 feet square, where he stows with his wife and family. From the number of souls crowded in so small a space, it must naturally be supposed they are horridly dirty, which is evidently the case, and their vessels swarm with all kinds of vermin, rats in particular, which they encourage to breed, and eat them as great delicacies. In fact, there are very few creatures they will not eat. During our captivity we lived 3 weeks on caterpillars boiled with rice. They are much addicted to gambling, and spend all their leisure hours at cards and smoking opium. End of section 16. Recording by Marion Martin.
Section 17 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 17. The Female Captive. The Female Captive, Lucretia Parker. The event which is here related is the capture, by the pirates, of the English sloop Eliza Ann, bound from St. John's to Antigua, and the massacre of the whole crew, 10 in number, with the exception of one female passenger, whose life, by the interposition of divine providence, was miraculously preserved. The particulars are copied from a letter written by the unfortunate Miss Parker, the female passenger above alluded to her brother in New York. St. John's, April 3rd, 1825. Dear Brother, you have undoubtedly heard of my adverse fortune, and the shocking incident that has attended me since I had the pleasure of seeing you in November last. Anticipating your impatience to be made acquainted with the more circumstantial detail of my extraordinary adventures, I shall not, on account of the interest which I know you must feel in my welfare, hesitate to oblige you. Yet I must declare to you that it is that consideration alone that prompts me to do it, as even the recollection of the scenes which I have witnessed, you must be sensible, must ever be alluded to with pain, and that I cannot reflect on what I have endured and the scenes of horror that I have been witness to without the severest shock. I shall now, brother, proceed to furnish you with the details of my misfortunes, as they occurred, without exaggeration, and if it should be your wish to communicate them to the public, through the medium of a public's print, or in any other way, you are at liberty to do it, and I shall consider myself amply rewarded if in a single instance it proves beneficial in removing a doubt in the minds of such who, although they dare not deny the existence of a supreme being, yet disbelieve he ever in any way revealed himself to his creatures. Let philosophy, as it is termed, smile with pity or contempt on my weakness or credulity. Yet the superintendence of a particular providence, interfering by second causes, is so apparent to me, and was so conspicuously displayed in the course of my afflictions, that I shall not banish it from my mind from the beginning to the end of my narration. On the 28th of February I took passage on board the ship Eliza Ann, Captain Charles Smith, for Antigua, in compliance with the earnest request of my brother Thomas and family, who had advised me that they had concluded to make that island the place of their permanent residence, having a few months previous purchased there a valuable plantation. We set sail with a favorable wind, and with every appearance of a short and pleasant voyage, and met with no incident to destroy or diminish those flattering prospects until about noon of the 14th day from that of our departure, when a small schooner was discovered standing toward us, with her deck full of men, and as she approached us, from her suspicious appearance there was not a doubt in the minds of any on board but that she was a pirate. When within a few yards of us, they gave a shout, and our decks were instantly crowded with the motley crew of desperadoes, armed with weapons of almost every description that can be mentioned, and with which they commenced their barbarous work by unmercifully beating and maiming all on board except myself. As a retreat was impossible, and finding myself surrounded by wretches whose yells, oaths, and imprecations made them more resemble demons than human beings, I fell on my knees, and from one who appeared to have the command I begged for mercy, and permission to retire to the cabin, that I might not be either the subject or a witness of the murderous scene that I had but little doubt was about to ensue. The privilege was not refused me. The monster in human shape, for such was then his appearance, conducted me by the hand himself to the companionway, and pointing to the cabin, said to me, "Descend and remain there, and you will be perfectly safe, for although pirates, we are not barbarians to destroy the lives of innocent females." Saying this, he closed the companion doors and left me alone, to reflect on my helpless and deplorable situation. It is indeed impossible for me, brother, to paint to your imagination what were my feelings at this moment. Being the only female on board, my terror, it cannot be expected, was much less than that of the poor devoted mariners. I resigned my life to the being who had lent it, and did not fail to improve the opportunity, which I thought it not improbable might be my last, to call on him for that protection which my situation so much at this moment required, and never shall I be persuaded but that my prayers were heard. While I remained in this situation, by the sound of the clashing of swords, attended by shrieks and dismal groans, I could easily imagine what was going on deck, and anticipated nothing better than the total destruction by the pirates of the lives of all on board. After I had remained about 1 hour and a half alone in the cabin, and all had become silent on deck, the cabin doors were suddenly thrown open, and 8 or 10 of the piratical crew entered, preceded by him whom I had suspected to be their leader, and from whom I had received assurances that I should not be injured. By him I was again addressed, and requested to banish all fears of personal injury, that they sought only for the money which they suspected to be secreted somewhere on board the vessel, and which they were determined to have, although unable to extort a disclosure of the place, and of its concealment by threats and violence, from the crew. The pirates now commenced a thorough search throughout the cabin. The trunks and chests belonging to the captain and mate were broken open, and rifled of their most valuable contents, nor did my baggage and stores meet any better fate. Indeed, this was a loss which at the moment caused me but little uneasiness. I felt that my life was too much in jeopardy to lament, in any degree, the loss of my worldly goods, surrounded as I was by a gang of the most ferocious-looking villains that my eyes ever before beheld, of different complexions, and each with a drawn weapon in his hand, some of them fresh crimsoned with the blood, as I then supposed, of my murdered countrymen, and whose horrid imprecations and oaths were enough to appall the bravest heart. Their search for money proving unsuccessful, with the exception of a few dollars which they found in the captain's chest, they returned to the deck, and setting sail on the sloop, steered her for the place of their rendezvous, a small island or key, not far distant, I imagine, from the island of Cuba, where we arrived the day after our capture. The island was nearly barren, producing nothing but a few scattered mangroves and shrubs, interspersed with the miserable huts of those outlaws of civilization, among whom power formed the only law, and every species of iniquity was here carried to an extent of which no person who had not witnessed a similar degree of pollution could form the most distant idea. As soon as the sloop was brought to an anchor, the hatches were thrown off, and the unfortunate crew ordered on deck, a command which, to my surprise, was instantly obeyed, as I had harbored strong suspicions that they had all been murdered by the pirates the day previous. The poor devoted victims, although alive, exhibited shocking proofs of the barbarity with which they had been treated by the unmerciful pirates, their bodies exhibiting deep wounds and bruises too horrible for me to attempt to describe. Yet, however great had been their sufferings, their lives had been spared only to endure still greater torments. Being strongly pinioned, they were forced into a small leaky boat and rowed on shore, which we having reached, and a division of plunder having been made by the pirates, a scene of the most bloody and wanton barbarity ensued, the bare recollection of which still chills my blood. Having first divested them of every article of clothing but their shirts and trousers, with swords, knives, axes, etc., they fell on the unfortunate crew of the Eliza Ann with the ferocity of cannibals. In vain did they beg for mercy and entreat of their murderers to spare their lives. In vain did poor Captain S. attempt to touch their feelings and move them to pity by representing to them the situation of his innocent family, that he had a wife and 3 small children at home, wholly dependent on him for support. But alas, the poor man entreated in vain. His appeal was to monsters possessing hearts callous to feelings of humanity. Having received a heavy blow from one with an axe, he snapped the cords with which he was bound and attempted to escape by flight, but was met by another of the ruffians, who plunged a knife or dirk into his heart. I stood near him at this moment and was covered with his blood. On receiving the fatal wound, he gave a single groan and fell lifeless at my feet. Nor were the remainder of the crew more fortunate. The mate, while on his knees imploring mercy, and promising to accede to anything that the vile assassins should require of him, on condition of his life being spared, received a blow from a club which instantaneously put a period to his existence. Dear brother, need I attempt to paint to your imagination my feelings at this awful moment? Will it not suffice for me to say that I have described to you a scene of horror which I was compelled to witness, and with the expectation, too, of being the next victim selected by these ferocious monsters, whose thirst for blood appeared to be insatiable? There appeared now but one alternative left me, which was to offer up a prayer to heaven for the protection of that being who has power to stay the assassin's hand, and who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above what we can ask or think. Sincerely, in the language of Scripture, I can say, I found trouble and sorrow, then called upon the name of the Lord. I remained on my knees until the inhuman wretches had completed their murderous task, and left none but myself to lament the fate of those who, but 24 hours before, were animated with the pleasing prospects of a quick voyage and a speedy return to the bosoms of their families. The wretch by whom I had been thrice promised protection, and who seemed to reign chief among them, again approached me with hands crimsoned with the blood of my murdered countrymen, and, with a savage smile, once more repeated his assurances that, if I would but become reconciled to my situation, I had nothing to fear. There was indeed something truly terrific in the appearance of this man, or rather monster, as he ought to be termed. He was of a swarthy complexion, nearly 6 feet in height. His eyes were large, black and penetrating. His expression was remarkable, and when silent his looks were sufficient to declare his meaning. He wore around his waist a leathern belt, to which was suspended a sword, a brace of pistols, and a dirk. He was, as I was afterward informed, the acknowledged chief among the pirates. All appeared to stand in awe of him, and no one dared to disobey his commands. Such, dear brother, was a character who had promised me protection if I would become reconciled to my situation, in other words, subservient to his will. But whatever might have been his intentions, although now in his power, without visible friend to protect me, yet such full reliance did I place in the Supreme Being, who sees and knows all things, and who has promised his protection to the faithful in the hour of their tribulation, that I felt myself in a less degree of danger than you or anyone would probably imagine. As the day drew near to a close, I was conducted to a small temporary hut or cabin, where I was informed I might repose peaceably for the night, which I did without being disturbed by anyone. This was another opportunity that I did not suffer to pass unimproved, to pour out my soul to that Being, who had already given me reasons to believe that he did not say to the house of Jacob, "Seek you me in vain." Oh, that all sincere Christians would in every difficulty make him their refuge. He is a hopeful stay. Early in the morning ensuing, I was visited by the wretch alone whom I had viewed as chief of the murderous band. As he entered and cast his eyes upon me, his countenance relaxed from its usual ferocity to a feigned smile. Without speaking a word, he seated himself on a bench that the cabin contained, and drawing a table towards him, leaned upon it, resting his cheek upon his hand. His eyes for some moments were fixed in steadfast gaze on the ground, while his whole soul appeared to be devoured by the most diabolical thoughts. In a few moments he arose from his seat and hastily traversed the hut, apparently in extreme agitation, and not infrequently fixing his eyes steadfastly upon me. But that Providence, which, while it protects the innocent, never suffers the wicked to go unpunished, interposed to save me and to deliver me from the hands of this remorseless villain, at the very instant when in all probability he intended to have destroyed my happiness forever. On a sudden the pirate's bugle was sounded, which, as I was afterward informed, was the usual signal of a sail in sight. The ruffian monster thereupon, without uttering a word, left my apartment, and hastened with all speed to the place of their general rendezvous on such occasions. Flattered by the pleasing hope that Providence might be about to complete her work of mercy, and was conducting to the dreary island some friendly aid to rescue me from my perilous situation, I mustered courage to ascend to the roof of my hovel, to discover, if possible, the cause of the alarm, and what might be the issue. A short distance from the island I espied a sail, which appeared to be lying to, and a few miles therefrom, to the windward, another, which appeared to be bearing down under the press of sail for the former. In a moment the whole gang of pirates, with the exception of 4, were in their boats, and with their oars, etc., were making every possible exertion to reach the vessel nearest to their island. But by the time they had effected their object, the more distant vessel, which proved to be a British sloop of war disguised, had approached them within fair gunshot, and probably knowing or suspecting their characters, opened their ports and commenced a destructive fire upon them. The pirates were now, as nearly as I could judge with the naked eye, thrown into great confusion. Every possible exertion appeared to have been made by them to reach the island, and escape from their pursuers. Some jumped from their boats and attempted to gain the shore by swimming, but those were shot in the water, and the remainder, who remained in their boats, were very soon after overtaken and captured by the 2 well-manned boats dispatched from the sloop of war for that purpose, and soon I had the satisfaction to see them all on board of the sloop, and in the power of those from whom I was fully satisfied that they should meet with the punishment due to their crimes. In describing the characters of this piratical band of robbers, I have, dear brother, represented them as wretches of the most frightful and ferocious appearance, bloodthirsty monsters, who in acts of barbarity ought only to be ranked with cannibals, who delight to feast on human flesh. Rendered desperate by their crimes, and aware that they should find no mercy if so unfortunate as to fall into the hands of those to whom they show no mercy, to prevent a possibility of detection and the just execution of the laws, wantonly destroy the lives of every one, however innocent, who may be so unfortunate as to fall into their power. Such, indeed, brother, is the true character of the band of pirates, to the number of 30 or 40, by whom it was my misfortune to be captured, with the exception of a single one, who possessed a countenance less savage, and had the appearance of possessing a heart less callous to the feelings of humanity. Fortunately for me, as divine providence ordered, this person was one of the 4 who remained on the island, and on whom the command devolved, after the unexpected disaster which had deprived them forever of so great a portion of their comrades. From this man, after the capture of the murderous tyrant, to whose commands he had been compelled to yield, I received the kindest treatment, and assurances that I should be restored to liberty and to my friends when an opportunity should present, or when it could be consistently done with the safety of their lives and liberty. This unhappy man, for such he declared himself to be, took an opportunity to indulge me with a partial relation of a few of the most extraordinary incidents of his life. He declared himself an Englishman by birth, but his real name and place of nativity was, he said, a secret he would never disclose. Although I must, said he, acknowledge myself by profession a pirate, yet I can boast of respectable parentage, and the time once was when I myself sustained an unimpeachable character. Loss of property, through the treachery of those whom I considered friends, and in whom I had placed implicit confidence, was what first led me to and induced me to prefer this mode of life to any of a less criminal nature. But although I voluntarily became the associate of a band of wretches, the most wicked and unprincipled perhaps on earth, yet I solemnly declare that I have not in any one instance personally deprived an innocent fellow creature of life. It was an act of barbarity at which my heart ever recoiled, and against which I always protested. With the property, I always insisted we ought to be satisfied, without the destruction of the lives of such who were probably the fathers of families, and who had never offended us. But our gang was, as you may suppose, chiefly composed of and governed by men without principle, who appeared to delight in the shedding of blood, and whose only excuse has been that by acting with too much humanity in the sparing of life, they might thereby be exposed and themselves arraigned to answer for their crimes at an earthly tribunal. You can have no conception, madam, continued he, of the immense property that has been piratically captured, and of the number of lives that have been destroyed by this gang alone, and all without the loss of a single one in our party until yesterday, when, by an unexpected circumstance, Our number has been reduced, as you see, from 35 to 4. This island has not been our constant abiding place, but the bodies of such as have suffered here have always been conveyed a considerable distance from the shore and thrown into the sea, where they are probably devoured by sharks, as not a single one has ever been known afterward to drift on our shores. The property captured has not been long retained on this island, but shipped to a neighboring port, where we have an agent to dispose of it. Of the great number of vessels captured by us," continued he, "you are the first and only female that has been so unfortunate as to fall into our hands, and from the moment that I first saw you in our power, well knowing the brutal disposition of him whom we acknowledged our chief, I trembled for your safety, and viewed you as one deprived perhaps of the protection of a husband or brother, to become the victim of an unpitying wretch, whose pretended regard for your sex and his repeated promises of protection were hypocritical, a mere mask to lull your fears until he could effect your ruin. His hellish designs, agreeable to his own declarations, would have been carried into effect the very morning that he last visited you, had not an all-wise Providence interfered to save you. And so sensible I am to the unexpected circumstance of his capture, as well as that of the most of our gang, as desperate and unprincipled as himself, must have been an order of him from whose all-seeing eye no evil transaction can be hidden, that were I so disposed, I should be deterred from doing you any injury through fear of meeting with a similar fate. Nor do my 3 remaining companions differ with me in opinion, and we all now most solemnly pledge ourselves that so long as you remain in our power you shall have nothing to complain of but the deprivation of society, of whose company, no doubt, would be more agreeable to you, and as soon as it can be done consistently with our safety, you shall be conveyed to a place from which you may obtain a passage to your friends. We have now become too few in number to hazard a reputation of our piratical robberies, and not only this, but some of our captured companions, to save their own lives, may prove treacherous enough to betray us. We are therefore making preparation to leave this island for a place of more safety, when you, madam, shall be conveyed and set at liberty as I have promised you. Dear brother, if you before doubted, is not the declaration of this man, which I have recorded as correctly as my recollection will admit of, sufficient to satisfy you that I owe my life and safety to the interposition of a divine providence? Oh yes, surely it is, and I feel my insufficiency to thank and praise my heavenly protector as I ought, for his loving kindness in preserving me from the evil designs of wicked men, and for finally restoring me to liberty and to my friends. I cannot praise him as I would, but he is merciful and good. From this moment every preparation was made by the pirates to remove from the island. The small quantity of stores and goods which remained on hand, principally of the Eliza Ann's cargo, was either buried on the island or conveyed away in their boats in the night to some place unknown to me. The last thing done was to demolish their temporary dwellings, which was done so effectually as not to suffer a vestige of anything to remain that could have led to a discovery that the island had ever been inhabited by such a set of beings. 11 days from that of the capture of the Eliza Ann, the pirates having previously put on board several bags of dollars, which from the appearance of the former I judged had been concealed in the earth, I was ordered to embark with them, but for what place I then knew not. About midnight I was landed on the rocky shores of an island which they informed me was Cuba. They furnished me with a few hard biscuit and a bottle of water, and directed me to proceed early in the morning in a northeast direction, to a house about a mile distant, where I was told I would be well treated and furnished with a guide that would conduct me to Mckenzie. With these directions they left me, and I never saw them more. At daybreak I set out in search of the house to which I had been directed by the pirates, and which I had the good fortune to reach in safety in about an hour and a half. It was a humble tenement thatched with canes, without any flooring on the ground, and was tenanted by a man and his wife only, from whom I met with a welcome reception, and by whom I was treated with much hospitality. Although Spaniards, the man could speak and understand enough English to converse with me, and to learn by what means I had been brought so unexpectedly alone and unprotected to his house. Though it was the same to which I had been directed by the pirates, yet he declared that so far from being in any way connected with them in their piratical robberies, or enjoying any portion of their ill-gotten gain, no one could hold them in greater abhorrence. Whether he was sincere in these declarations or not is well known to him who the lying tongue cannot deceive. But it is justice to them to say that both by the man and his wife I was treated with kindness, and it was with apparent emotions of pity that they listened to the tale of my sufferings. By their earnest request I remained with them until the morning ensuing, when I set out on foot to Montansi's, accompanied by the Spaniard who had kindly offered to conduct me to that place, which we reached about 7 in the evening the same day. At Montansi's I found many Americans and Europeans, by whom I was kindly treated, and who proffered their services to restore me to my friends. But as there were no vessels bound direct from thence to Antigua or St. John's, I was persuaded to take passage for Jamaica, where it was the opinion of my friends I might obtain a passage more speedily for one or the other place, and where I safely arrived after a pleasant voyage of 4 days. The most remarkable and unexpected circumstance of my extraordinary adventures I have yet, dear brother, to relate. Soon after my arrival at Jamaica, the authority having been made acquainted with the circumstance of my recent capture by the pirates, and the extraordinary circumstances which produced my liberation, requested that I might be conducted to the prison, to see if I could, among a number of pirates recently committed, recognize any of those by whom I had been captured. I was accordingly attended by 2 or 3 gentlemen and 2 young ladies, who had politely offered to accompany me, to the prison apartment, on entering which I not only instantly recognized among a number therein confined the identical savage monster of whom I had so much occasion to speak, the pirate's chief, but the most of those who had composed his gang, and who were captured with him. The sudden and unexpected introduction into their apartment of one whom they had probably in their minds numbered with the victims of their wanton barbarity produced unquestionably on their minds not an inconsiderable degree of horror as well as surprise, and, considering their condemnation now certain, they had no doubt heaped curses upon their more fortunate companions for sparing the life and setting at liberty one whom an all-wise Providence had conducted to and placed in a situation to bear witness to their unprecedented barbarity. Government having through me obtained the necessary proof of the guilt of these merciless wretches, after a fair and impartial trial they were all condemned to suffer the punishment due to their crimes, and 7 ordered for immediate execution, one of whom was a barbarian, their chief. After the conviction and condemnation of this wretch, in hopes of eluding the course of justice, he made, as I was informed, an attempt on his own life, by inflicting upon himself deep wounds with a knife which he had concealed for that purpose. But in this he was disappointed, the wounds not proving so fatal as he probably anticipated. I never saw this hardened villain or any of his equally criminal companions after their condemnation, although strongly urged to witness their execution, and am therefore indebted to one who daily visited them for the information of their behavior from that period until that of their execution, which, as regarded the former, I was informed was extremely impenitent, while that proceeding to the place of ignominy and death he talked with shocking unconcern, hinting that by being instrumental in the destruction of so many lives, he had become too hardened and familiar with death to feel much intimidated at its approach. He was attended to the place of execution by a Roman Catholic priest, who, it was said, labored to convince him of the atrociousness of his crimes, but he seemed deaf to all admonition and exhortation, and appeared insensible to the hope of happiness or fear of torment in a future state, and, so far from exhibiting a single symptom of penitence, declared that he knew of but one thing for which he had cause to reproach himself, which was in the sparing of my life and not ordering me to be butchered as the others had been. How awful was the end of the life of this miserable criminal! He looked not with harmony, regard, or a single penitent feeling toward one human being in the last agonies of an ignominious death. After remaining 9 days at Jamaica, I was so fortunate as to obtain a passage with Captain Elsmore direct for St. John's. The thoughts of once more returning home, and of so soon joining my anxious friends, when I could have an opportunity to communicate to my aged parents, to a beloved sister, and a large circle of acquaintances, the sad tale of the misfortunes which had attended me since I bid them adieu, would have been productive of the most pleasing sensations, had they not been interrupted by the melancholy reflection that I was a bearer of tidings of the most heartrending nature, to the bereaved families of those unfortunate husbands and parents who had in my presence fallen victim to piratical barbarity. Thankful should I have been, had the distressing duty fell to the lot of some one with less sensibility, but unerring Providence had ordered otherwise. We arrived safe at our port of destination, after a somewhat boisterous passage of 18 days. I found my friends all well, but the effects produced on their minds by the relation of the distressing incidents and adverse fortune that had attended me since my departure, I shall not attempt to describe, and much less can you expect, brother, that I should attempt a description of the feelings of the afflicted widow and fatherless child who first received from me the melancholy tidings that they were so. Thus, brother, I have furnished you with as minute a detail of the sad misfortunes that have attended me in my intended passage to Antigua in February and March last, as the circumstances will admit of. And here permit me once more to repeat my inquiry. Is it not sufficient to satisfy you and every reasonable person that I owe my life and liberty to the interposition of a divine providence? So fully am I persuaded of this, dear brother, and of my great obligations to that Supreme Being, who turned not away from my prayer nor his mercy from me, that I am determined to engage with my whole heart to serve him the residue of my days on earth, by the aid of his heavenly grace, and invite all who profess to fear him, should a single doubt remain on their minds, to come and hear what he hath done for me. I am, dear brother, affectionately yours, Lucretia Parker. Footnotes 26 from an old pamphlet published in 1825. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 18. The Passing of Mogul Mckenzie, the Last of the North Atlantic Pirates, by Arthur Hunt Shute. In the farther end of the Bay of Fundy, about a mile off from the Nova Scotian coast, is the Isle of Haut. It is a strange rocky island that rises several hundred feet sheer out of the sea, without any bay or inlets. A landing can only be effected there in the calmest weather, and on account of the tremendous ebb of the Fundy tides, which rise and fall 60 feet every 12 hours, the venturesome explorer cannot long keep his boat moored against the precipitous cliffs. Because of this inaccessibility, little is known of the solitary island. Within its rampart walls of rock they say there is a green valley, and in its center is a fathomless lake, where the Micmac Indians used to bury their dead, and hence its dread appellation of the Island of the Dead. Beyond these bare facts nothing more is certain about the secret valley and the haunted lake. Many wild and fabulous descriptions are current, but they are merely the weavings of fancy. Sometimes on a stormy night the unhappy navigators of the North Channel miss the coast lights in the fog, and out from the Isle of Haut a gentle undertow flirts with their bewildered craft. Then, little by little, they are gathered into a mighty current against which all striving is in vain, and in the white foam among the iron cliffs their ship is pounded into splinters. The quarry which she gathers in so softly at first, and so fiercely at last, however, is soon snatched away from the siren shore. The ebb tide bears every sign of wreckage far out into the deeps of the Atlantic, and not a trace remains of the ill-starred vessel or her crew. But one of the boats in the fishing fleet never comes home, and from lonely huts on the coast reproachful eyes are cast upon the Island of the Dead. On the long winter nights, when the boys gather about the fire in Old Steele's general stores at Hall's Harbor, their hard grey life becomes bright for a spell. When a keg of hard cider is flowing freely, the grim fishermen forget their taciturnity. The ice is melted from their speech, and the floodgates of their souls pour forth. But ever in the background of their talk, unforgotten, like a haunting shadow, is the island of the dead. Of their weirdest and most blood-curdling yarns, it is always the center. And when at last, with uncertain steps, they leave the empty keg and the dying fire to turn homeward, through the drifting snow, fearful and furtive glances are cast to where the island looms up like a ghostly sentinel from the sea. Across its high promontory the northern lights scintillate and blaze, and out of its moving brightness the terrified fishermen behold the war canoes of dead Indians, freighted with their red-skinned braves, the forms of coeurs de bois and desperate Frenchmen swinging down the skyline in a ghastly snake dance, the shapes and spars of ships long since forgotten from the missing list, and always, most dread-inspiring of them all, the distress signals from the sinking ship of Mogul Mckenzie and his pirate crew. Captain Mogul Mckenzie was the last of the pirates to scourge the North Atlantic seaboard. He came from that school of freebooters that was let loose by the American Civil War. With a letter of marque from the Confederate States, he sailed the seas to prey on Yankee shipping. He and his fellow privateers were so thorough in their work of destruction that the mercantile marine of the United States was ruined for a generation to come. When the war was over, the defeated South called off her few remaining bloodhounds on the sea. But Mckenzie, who was still at large, had drunk too deeply of the wine of a wild, free life. He did not return to lay down his arms, but began on a course of shameless piracy. He lived only a few months under the black flag, until he went down on the Isle of Haute. The events of that brief and thrilling period are unfortunately obscure, with only a ray of light here and there, but the story of his passing is the most weird of all the strange yarns that are spun about the island of the dead. In May 1865, a gruesome discovery was made off the coast of Maine, which sent a chill of fear through all the seaport towns of New England. A whaler bound for New Bedford was coming up Cape Cod one night long after dark. There was no fog, and the lights of approaching vessels could easily be discerned. The man on the lookout felt no uneasiness at his post when, without any warning of bells or lights, the sharp bow of a brigantine suddenly loomed up, hardly a ship's length in front. "What the blazes are you trying to do?" roared the mate from the bridge, enraged at this unheard-of violation of the right-of-way. But no voice answered his challenge, and the brigantine went swinging by, with all her sails set to a spanking breeze. She bore directly across the bow of the whaler, which just grazed her stern in passing. "There's something rotten on board there," said the mate. "Aye," said the captain, who had come on the bridge, "there's something rotten there, right enough. Swing your helm to port, and get after the devils," he ordered. "Aye, aye, sir," came the ready response, and nothing lost, the helmsman changed his course to follow the eccentric craft. She was evidently bound on some secret mission, for not otherwise would she thus tear through the darkness, before the wind, without the flicker of a light. The whaler was the swifter of the two ships, and she could soon have overhauled the other, but fearing some treachery, the captain refrained from running her down until daylight. All night long she seemed to be veering her course, attempting to escape from her pursuer. In the morning, off the coast of Maine, she turned her nose directly out to sea. Then a boat was lowered from the whaler and rowed out to intercept the oncoming vessel. When they were directly in her course, they lay on their oars and waited. The brigantine did not veer again, but came steadily on, and soon the whalemen were alongside, and made themselves fast to a dinghy which she had in tow. A few minutes of apprehensive waiting followed, and as nothing happened, one of the boldest swung himself up over the tow rope onto the deck. He was followed by the others, and they advanced cautiously, with drawn knives and pistols. Not a soul was to be seen, and the men who were brave enough before a charging whale trembled with fear. The wheel and the lookout were alike deserted, and no sign of life could be discovered anywhere below. In the galley were the embers of a dead fire, and the table in the captain's cabin was spread out ready for a meal which had never been eaten. On deck everything was spick and span, and not the slightest evidence of a storm or any other disturbance could be found. The theory of a derelict was impossible. Apparently all had been well on board, and they had been sailing with good weather, when, without any warning, her crew had been suddenly snatched away by some dread power. The sailors with one accord agreed that it was the work of a sea serpent, but the mate had no place for the ordinary superstitions of the sea, and he still scoured the hold, expecting at any minute to encounter a dead body or some other evil evidence of foul play. Nothing more, however, was found, and the mate at length had to end his search with the unsatisfactory conclusion that the St. Clair, a brigantine registered from Hartpool with cargo of lime, had been abandoned on the high seas for no apparent reason. Her skipper had taken with him the ship's papers and had not left a single clue behind. A crew was told off to stand by the St. Clair to bring her into port, and the others climbed into the longboat to row back to the whaler. "Just see if there is a name on that there dinghy before we go," said the mate. An exclamation of horror broke from one of the men as he read on the bow of the dinghy the name, Kanawha. The faces of all went white with a dire alarm as the facts of the mystery suddenly flashed before them. The Kanawha was the ship in which Captain Mogul Mckenzie had made himself notorious as a privateersman. Every one had heard her awe-inspiring name, and every Yankee seafaring man prayed that he might never meet her on the seas. After the Alabama was sunk and the Tallahassee was withdrawn, the Kanawha still remained to threaten the shipping of the North. For a long time her whereabouts had been unknown, and then she was discovered by a Federal gunboat, which gave chase and fired upon her. Without returning fire, she raced in for shelter amongst the dangerous islands off Cape Sable, and was lost in the fog. Rumor had it that she ran on the rocks off that perilous coast, and sank with all on board. As time went by, and there was no more sign of the corsair, the rumor was accepted as proven. Men began to spin yarns in the forecastle about Mogul Mckenzie, with an interest that was tinged with its former fear. Skippers were beginning to feel at ease again on the grim waters, when suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, came the awful news of the discovery of the St. Clair. Gunboats put off to scour the coastline, and again with fear and trembling, the lookout began to eye suspiciously every new sail coming up on the horizon. One afternoon, toward the end of May, a schooner came tearing into Portland Harbor with all her canvas crowded on and flying distress signals. Her skipper said that off the island of Campobello he had seen a long gray sailing ship with auxiliary power sweeping down upon him. As the wind was blowing strong inshore, he had taken to his heels and made for Portland. He was chased all the way, and his pursuer did not drop him until he was just off the harbor bar. Many doubted his story, however, saying that no one would dare to chase a peaceful craft so near to a great port in broad daylight. And again it was urged that an auxiliary vessel could easily have overhauled the schooner between Campobello and Portland. The fact that the captain of the schooner was as often drunk as sober, and that when he was under the influence of drink he was given to seeing visions, was pointed to as conclusive proof that his yarn was a lie. After the New Bedford whaler came into port with the abandoned St. Clair, it was known beyond doubt that the Kanawha was a real menace, but nobody cared to admit that Mogul Mckenzie was as bold as the schooner's report would imply, and hence countless arguments were put forward to allay such fears. But a few days later the fact that the pirates were still haunting their coast was absolutely corroborated. A coastal packet from Boston arrived at Yarmouth with the news that she had not only sighted Kanawha in the distance, but they had crossed each other's paths so near that the name could be discerned beyond question with a spyglass. She was heading up the Bay of Fundy and did not pause or pay any heed to the other ship. This news brought with it consternation, and every town and village along the Fundy was now ahum with stories and theories about the pirate ship. The interest, instead of being abated, was augmented as the days went by with no further report. In the public houses and along the quays, it was almost the only topic of conversation. The excitement became almost feverish when it was known that several captains, outward bound, had taken with them a supply of rifles and ammunition. The prospect of a fight seemed imminent. About a week after the adventure of the Boston packet, Her Majesty's ship Buzzard appeared off Yarmouth harbor. The news of the Kanawha had come to the admiral at Halifax, and he had dispatched the warship to cruise about the troubled coast. "That'll be the end of old Mogul Mckenzie, now that he's got an English ship on his trail," averred a Canadian as he sat drinking in the Yarmouth Light with a group of seafaring men of various nationalities. "It takes the British jack-tar to put the kibosh on this pirate game. One of them is worth a shipload of Yankees at the business." "Well, don't you crow too loud now," replied a Boston skipper. "I reckon that Nova Scotian booze artist who ran into Portland the other day, scared of his shadow, would not do you fellows much credit." "Yes, but what about your gunboats that have had the job of fixing the Kanawha for the last 3 years and haven't done it yet?" The feelings between Canada and the United States were none too good just after the Civil War, and the Canadian was bound not to lose this opportunity for horseplay. "You're a fine crowd of sea dogs, you are, you fellas from the Boston Tea Party. 3 years after one little half-drowned rat, and haven't got him yet. Wouldn't Sir Francis Drake or Lord Nelson be proud of the record that you long-legged, slab-sided Yankees have made on the sea?" "Shut your mouth, you blue-nosed, down-east herring choker!" roared the Yankee skipper. "I reckon we've given you traitors that tried to stab us in the back a good enough licking. And if any more of your dirty dogs ever come nosing about down south of Mason and Dixon's line, I'll bet they'll soon find out what our record is." "Well, you fools can waste your tongue and wind," said a third man, raising his glass. "But for me, here's good luck to the Buzzard." "So say we, all of us," chimed in the others, and the Yankee and the Canadian drank together to the success of the British ship, forgetting their petty jealousies before a common foe. Everywhere the news of the arrival of the British ship was hailed with delight. All seemed to agree that her presence assured the speedy extermination of the pirate crew. But after several days of futile cruising about the coast, her commander, to escape from a coming storm, had to put into St. Mary's Bay, with the object of his search still eluding his vigilance. He only arrived in time to hear the last chapter of the Kanawha's tale of horrors. The night before, Dominique Lefontaine, a farmer living alone at Mckenzie, a little village on the French shore, had been awakened from his sleep by the moaning and wailing of a human voice. For days the imminent peril of an assault from the pirates had filled the people of the French coast with forebodings. And now, awakened thus in the dead of night, the lonely Frenchman was well nigh paralyzed with terror. With his flesh creeping and his eyes wide, he groped for his rifle, and waiting in the darkness, while ever and anon came those unearthly cries from the beach. Nearly an hour passed before he could gather himself together sufficiently to investigate the cause of the alarm. At last, when the piteous wailing had grown weak and intermittent, the instinct of humanity mastered his fears, and he went forth to give a possible succor to the one in need. On the beach, lying prostrate, with the water lapping about his feet, he found a man in the last stage of exhaustion. The blood was flowing from his mouth, and as Dominique turned him over to stanch its flow, he found that his tongue had been cut out, and hence the unearthly wailing which had roused him from his sleep. The beach was deserted by this time, and it was too dark to see far out into the bay. Dominique carried the unfortunate man to his house and nursed him there for many weeks. He survived his frightful experiences and lived on for 20 years, a pathetic and helpless figure, supported by the big-hearted farmers and fishermen of the French shore. Evidently he had known too much for his enemies, and they had sealed his mouth forever. He became known as the mysterious man of Mckenzie, and his deplorable condition was always pointed to as a mute witness of the last villainy of Mogul Mckenzie. On the night following the episode of the mysterious man of Mckenzie, a wild and untoward storm swept down the North Atlantic and over the seaboard far and near. In the Bay of Fundy that night, the elements met in their grandest extremes. Tide rips and mountain waves opposed each other with titanic force. All along the bleak and rock-ribbed coast, the boiling waters lay churned into foam. Over the breakwaters, the giant combers crashed and soared far up into the troubled sky, while out under the black clouds of the night, the whirlpools and the tempests met. Was ever a night like this before? Those on shore thanked God, and those with fathers on the sea gazed out upon a darkness where no star of hope could shine. Now and again through the Stygian gloom a torrent of sheet lightning rolled down across the heavens, bringing in its wake a moment of terrible light. It was in one of these brief moments of illumination that the wan watchers at Hall's Harbor discerned a long gray ship being swept like a spectre before the winds toward the Isle of Haut. Until the flash of lightning, the doomed seamen appeared to have been unconscious of their fast approaching fate, and then, as if suddenly awakened, they sent a long thin trail of light to wind itself far up into the darkness. Again and again the rockets shot upward from her bow, while above the noises of the tempest came the roar of a gun. The people on the shore looked at each other with blanched faces, speechless, helpless. A lifetime by that shore had taught them the utter puniness of the sons of men. Others would have tried to do something with what they thought was their strong arm, but the fishermen knew too well that the Fundy's arm was stronger. In silence they waited with bated breath while the awful moments passed. Imperturbable they stood there, with their feet in the white foam and their faces in the salt spray, and gazed at the curtain of the night, behind which a tragedy was passing, as dark and dire as any in the annals of the sea. Another flash of lightning, and there, dashing upon the iron rocks, was a great ship with all her sails set, and a cloud of lurid smoke trailing from her funnel. She was grey-colored with auxiliary power, and as her lines dawned upon those who saw her in the moment of light, they burst out with one accord, "It's the Kanawha! It's the Kanawha!" As if in answer to their sudden cry, another gun roared, and another shower of rockets shot up into the sky, and then all was lost again in the darkness and the voices of the tempest. Next morning the winds had gone out with the tide, and when in the afternoon the calm waters had risen, a boat put off from Hall's Harbour and rowed to the Isle of Haut. For several hours the rocky shores were searched for some traces of the wreck, but not a spar or splinter could be found. All about the bright waters laughed, with naught but the sunbeams on their bosom, and not a shadow remained from last night's sorrow on the sea. So Mogul Mckenzie, who had lived a life of stress, passed out on the wings of storm. In his end, as always, he baffled pursuit, and was sought, but could not be found. His sailings on the sea were in secret, and his last port in death was a mystery. But as has been already related, when the northern lights come down across the haunted island, the distress signals of his pirate crew are still seen shooting up into the night. Footnotes 27 from Blackwood's Magazine. End of 18. The Passing of Mogul Mckenzie. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago. gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee.
Of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 19. The Last of the Sea Rovers. The Riff Coast Pirates. Footnote. From the Nautical Magazine. End footnote. W. B. Lord. O nay, then said our king, O nay, this must not be. To yield to such a rover, myself will not agree. He hath deceived the Frenchman, likewise the King of Spain. And how can he be true to me, that hath been false to twain? Old Sea Song of the year 1620. Probably by this time the greater part of the piratical craft along the Riff coast has been destroyed, and the long-promised Moorish gunboats stationed there to protect foreign shipping. These steps have doubtless been hastened by the fact that the pirates, unfortunately for themselves, attacked a vessel some little time ago belonging to the Sultan of Morocco. For years past, the governments of several European powers have sought to put friendly pressure upon the Sultan of Morocco to effectually stop the depredations of the Riffian coast pirates. No strong measures, however, were really taken until the above episode occurred. It is said that in early days the Moors were some time in accustoming themselves to the perils of the deep. At first they marveled greatly at those that go down to the sea in ships and have their business in great waters, but they did not hasten to follow their example. One eminent ruler of ancient times in that region, when asked what the sea was like, replied, "The sea is a huge beast, which silly folk ride like worms on logs. But it afterwards became clear that the Moors had a strong fancy for the worms and logs too. They gave up marvelling at those who went to sea, and went on it themselves in search of plunder. The risk, the uncertainty, the danger, the sense of superior skill and ingenuity that attract the adventurous spirit, and the passion for sport, are stated by some writers to have brought such a state of things into existence. One fact seems to be pretty certain, that when these depredations were first made, they took the form of reprisals upon the Spaniards. No sooner was Granada fallen than thousands of desperate Moors left the land, disdaining to live under a Spanish yoke. Settling along a portion of the northern coast of Africa, they immediately proceeded to first attack all Spanish vessels that could be found. Their quickness and knowledge of the coast gave them the opportunity of reprisals for which they longed. Probably this got monotonous in course of time, for in their wild sea courses they took to harrying the vessels belonging to other nations, and so laid the foundation for a race of pirates, which has continued down to quite recently. As nowadays, the Moors cruised in boats from the commencement of their marauding expeditions. Each man pulled an oar, and knew how to fight as well as row. Drawing little water, a small squadron of these craft could be pushed up almost any creek, or lie hidden behind a rock, till the enemy came in sight. Then oars out, and a quick stroke for a few minutes. Next they were alongside their unsuspecting prey, and pouring in a first volley. Ultimately the prize was usually taken, the crew put in irons, and the pirates returned home with their capture, no doubt being received with acclamation upon their arrival. As far back as the 16th century, the Spanish forts at Alhucemas, not to mention other places, were established for the purpose of repressing piracy in its vicinity. Considerable interest is attached to several of the piracies committed during the past few years, as they culminated in strong representations being made to the Sultan of Morocco by the various governments under whose flags the respective vessels sailed. Some of them went so far as to send warships to cruise along the Riffian coast. This step apparently had some moral effect upon the pirates, for from that time onwards attacks upon foreign vessels practically ceased. Something more than this, however, was needed, for no one could say how soon the marauding expeditions might be renewed upon a larger scale than ever, so as to make up for lost opportunities. On August 14, 1897, the Italian three-masted schooner Fiducia was off the coast of Morocco, in the Mediterranean, homeward bound from Pensacola to Marseille. Here she got becalmed, and while in that condition 2 boats approached her from the shore. At first the crew of the Fiducia thought they were native fishing boats. When, however, the latter got within 100 yards or so of the helpless vessel, the suspicions of the crew were aroused. The captain warned the Moors not to approach any nearer. A volley of bullets was returned by way of reply, followed by a regular fusillade as the boats advanced. There were only 3 revolvers on board the schooner, and with these the crew prepared to defend themselves. Soon, however, their supply of ammunition became exhausted, and the pirates boarded the schooner without further opposition. The vessel was at once ransacked, even the clothes of the crew being taken. The ship's own boat was lowered, and into this the marauders put their booty, and took it ashore, also carrying the captain and one of the crew with them. About an hour later, another boat, containing about 20 pirates, came off and fired on the ship. The crew, seeing that they could offer no effective resistance, hid themselves away in the hold. The other pirates had left very little for the new arrivals to take, and this seemed to annoy them so much that they gave vent to their ill feelings in several ways, not the least wanton being the pollution of the ship's fresh water. They also smashed the vessel's compass, and tore up the charts. For the next 2 days the crew existed on a few biscuits, which the pirates had left behind. The following day the British steamship Oanfa of London hove into sight. The crew of the schooner hoisted a shirt as a signal, which was fortunately seen, and a boat sent off in response thereto. Assistance was promptly rendered, and the Fiducia put in a position to resume her voyage. This was done until spoken by the Italian cruiser Ercole, which assisted the schooner to her destination. In October 1896 the French bark Prosper Carew was lying becalmed off Alhucemas, a place fortified by the Spaniards to keep the pirates in check, when several boats full of armed Moors seized the vessel and made the crew prisoners. They then completely pillaged the ship, removing almost everything of any use or value. While the miscreants were thus busily engaged, a Spanish merchant steamship named the Sevilla happened to come along, and was in time to capture 1 boat and rescue several of the prisoners. The Sevilla then made towards the bark, but the pirates opened fire on the steamer, killing and wounding some of the crew. The Spaniard was compelled to retire, leaving the captain of the bark in the hands of the Moors. Subsequently the bark was picked up in an abandoned condition by the British steamship Oswin and towed into Almeria. An arrangement was afterwards made with the pirates to release the captains of the Fudicia and the Portuguese bark Rosita Faru, a much earlier capture, and some members of both crews, in exchange for the ruffians captured by the Spanish steamer Sevilla and a ransom of $3,000. It was only after prolonged negotiations and a large sum of money that a French warship succeeded in obtaining the freedom of the captain of the Prosper Corue and a few other Frenchmen. For some reason or other the pirates seemed very much disinclined to part with these prisoners. Only a short time before the attack on the French bark took place, a notice was issued by the British Board of Trade, in which the attention of ship owners and masters of vessels was called to the dangers attending navigation off the coast of Morocco. The document then proceeded to detail the case of a British schooner Mayor, of Gibraltar, which was boarded about 10 miles from the Riff coast by 20 Moors armed with rifles and daggers. As usual, the pirates ransacked the vessel, destroyed the ensign and ship's papers, brutally assaulted the men on board, and then made off in their boat. Scarcely had the foregoing notice been generally circulated that another case of similar character happened in connection with the Italian schooner Scatolia. Again there is the Spanish cutter Jacob. She was running along the Moorish coast one fine summer's evening a few years since, when a boat full of pirates suddenly came alongside, and speedily upset the quietness which had previously reigned on board the Jacob. 5 of the crew managed to escape in the cutter's boat, and were picked up some days later by a passing vessel. Those who remained on board the cutter fared very badly. After the vessel had been pillaged, the rigging and sails destroyed, the men were all securely bound and left to their fate. Fortunately the weather continued fine, and the Jacob drifted towards the Spanish coast, where she was seen and assistance promptly rendered. The captain of another Spanish vessel had quite a thrilling adventure along these pirates in May 1892. He left Gibraltar in command of the bark San Antonio for Alcumus, and when about 6 miles from Penon de la Gomera, a boat manned by 13 Moors was observed to be approaching the vessel. When near enough they opened fire, and ordered the captain to lower his sails, which was done, as the Spaniards were, practically speaking, without arms. The Moors then boarded the San Antonio and took her in tow. When close to the land the captain was rowed ashore, and the pirates spent part of the night in unloading the cargo. Next morning the San Antonio was seen drifting out to sea, and the captain, who was afraid of being put to death, suggested that he should go on board and bring her back to anchorage. Probably thinking that some of their comrades were on the bark, but unable to set the necessary canvas to return, only 2 Moors were sent off with the captain, and these remained in the boat when the vessel was reached. Upon gaining the deck of the bark the captain was surprised to find himself alone. Without hesitating for a moment he released the crew, who were confined below, hoisted sail, and stood out to sea. The Moors who had been left in the boat were speedily cut adrift, much to their amazement, for it so happened that none of the pirates had stayed on board. No doubt they were eager to find a safe hiding place for their plunder, and thinking the bark still quite secure till morning, took no further heed of the matter. A few days later the San Antonio arrived at Gibraltar, where full particulars of the outrage were furnished to the authorities. Space will not admit of details being given of the attacks on the Spanish bark Goleta, the Portuguese bark Rosita Faro, the British felucca Joven Enrique, and other vessels. It should be mentioned, however, that several famous and foreign sailing yachts upon various occasions have had remarkably narrow escapes from being captured by these sea ruffians. It is sincerely to be hoped that the Sultan of Morocco is carrying out his task in such a manner as will induce the inhabitants of the Riff coast to follow some occupation in future which is more likely to be appreciated by those who have to navigate vessels in the Mediterranean. Previous to stern measures being taken by the Sultan, it was not at all uncommon for his envoys to the native tribes, for the purpose of obtaining the release of captives, to be received with derision. Often, too, they were maltreated to such an extent that they were glad to escape with their lives. Some of the neighboring tribes continually endeavored to purchase captives for the pleasure of killing them, but it is satisfactory to learn that no sales are recorded, as the anticipated ransom was always largely in excess of the sums offered by the bloodthirsty natives. End of Chapter 19. End of Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Recording by James Christopher. Phoenix, Arizona, December 2008.